The main event of my evening turned out in any case to take place at the opposite end of the age and gender scale. It suddenly seemed to me that Martin's sister Sally did not perhaps find me entirely repulsive. As the evening gently evaporated, I found myself taking her arm in the street and seeing, through quite a lot of fog, I now remember, the looming bulk of the Cadogan Hotel. Perhaps a little flown with wine, I suddenly and confusedly felt that it might be a fine thing to take her to the very place where Oscar Wilde had been arrested. I couldn't possibly afford it, but then, as I thought about it, I couldn't possibly afford not to do it once I had thought about it. The Wilde suite itself was not available, but we did procure a decent room, and things proceeded happily enough. Ghost of Oscar or no ghost of Oscar, I did briefly allow myself to wonder if there was anything remotely subliminal or oblique in what I was doing. Sally had rather the same colouring as the brother I was beginning to adore, though not at all the same face. It was years until it was established that she was not Kingsley's daughter, but that's another tale altogether. I find now that I can more or less acquit myself on any charge of having desired Martin carnally. My own looks by then had in any case declined to the point where only women would go to bed with me. What eventuated instead was the most heterosexual relationship that one young man could conceivably have with another. As the days became weeks and the months became seasons, and as we fell happily into the habit of lunching and dining and party-going à deux, there began an inexhaustible conversation about womanhood in all its forms and varieties and permutations, that saw us through several episodes of sexual drought, as well as through some periods of embarrassment of riches. It was not, or not by any means all, the locker-room talk that you may imagine, though any reader of Martin's novels will know how brilliantly inventive is his capacity for bawdry. I refuse to say obscenity, because the obscene is too easy, and besides, it's always either quite humourless or too dependent for its humour on the knowledge that mere infants have of the human anatomy. The crudest thing that comes to mind, because it is such a cliché element of male fantasy, was our word, annexed from something said by Clive James, for the possibility of enjoying two young ladies at the same time. The term for this remote but intriguing contingency, which I still think was at least partially redeemed by its inventiveness, was a car wash. Think about it, or forget it if you can. Incidentally, Kingsley's novel The Green Man contains the best ever depiction of one of the many ways that this much-rehearsed ideal can go badly wrong in practice. It might have been anyone, actually I'm sure it was our poet friend Craig Raine, who came up with the appalling yet unforgettable idea that there is a design flaw in the female form, and that the breasts and the buttocks really ought to be on the same side. But it was Martin who went to all the trouble, with deadpan and dead-on acuity, of arguing the respective merits of which side that ought to be. One doesn't necessarily want to see both features walking towards one, for example, but then again, it might be dispiriting to see them both simultaneously marching away. As for metaphors, everybody has at one point seen men standing in front of the pornography section in either a magazine store or a video emporium, but it was Martin who observed these swaying and muttering figures, pulling out and then replacing the contents, and compared it to the Wailing Wall. He had an instinctive understanding of the relationship between Eros and Thanatos. One winter he was suffering quite badly from flu and left the New Statesman office early to go home. I agreed to walk an abnormally subdued and muffled Martin down the gelid street to Holborn Tube Station. As we trudged along, there was a girl in front of us who looked as if she was walking on beautifully fluted stilts. "How might it be," he murmured thoughtfully, with absolutely no leer or salacity. At once, it seemed, he'd brightened and straightened and ceased to snuffle. This was a tiny aspect of an elaborate and detailed investigation of the feminine mystique, a scrupulous weighing of evidence and comparing of notes. I would love to be able to give the impression that it was a relationship between equals, but if represented in cartoon form, the true picture would be closer to one of those great white sharks that evolution has fitted out with an accompanying but rather smaller fish. Picture my mixed emotions at appearing in Martin's novel The Pregnant Widow in the character of his elder brother. I would turn up at parties with Martin, to be sure, but with a rather resigned attitude. At one soirée in Holland Park he was introduced to a young woman with a result that was as close as made no difference to witnessing a lightning strike or a thunderbolt. His then-girlfriend was present at the party, as I think was the other young lady's husband, but what then happened in the adjoining room was unstoppable and seemed somehow foreordained. We both knew that the subsequent pregnancy was almost certainly also a consequent one. But so gentlemanly was the husband in the case that it was not until 2 decades later that Martin received the letter from his missing daughter, the lovely Delilah Seal, his bonding with whom, there doesn't seem to be another word for it, is one of the most affecting things I've ever chanced to see. And she, the offspring of that thunderbolt moment, has now become the mother of Martin's first grandchild, another thought that gives me a reflective but piercingly sweet pang. Pasternak was not perhaps such a fool when he wrote in Dr. Zhivago that all conceptions are immaculate. As I write this, I have just read a roundup of authorial opinion printed by a London Sunday newspaper to coincide with Martin's 60th birthday. It's one of the most dispiriting things I've ever seen in print. With a few exceptions, the contributors seem provincial and resentful and sunk in their own mediocrity. After all this time, they're obsessed with Martin's supposed head start in having had a distinguished father, and with the question of whether or not he is a misogynist. On the first point, he's answered quite well for himself. Yes, it's just like taking over the family pub. And on the second, I have to reconcile myself with much annoyance to the fact that most people never saw him with his sister, will never see him with his daughters, or his legion of female friends, not by any means all of whom are former conquests. So far from being some jaded Casanova, Martin possesses the rare gift, enviable if potentially time-consuming, of being able to find something attractive in almost any woman. If this be misogyny, then give us increase of it. I could tell that Martin was fitted for glory in work as well as life, and when the Rachel Papers was a huge critical and commercial grand slam, I sent him a long telegram. It was a stave from F. Scott Fitzgerald's early success. Of course, in some ways this was inappropriate. Scotty burned out and died at 44 and is buried along with poor mad Zelda, not far from me in Rockville, Maryland, but to us then, the age of 40 lay well over the horizon. It wasn't really true of Martin, as Fitzgerald had put it, that premature success gives one an almost mystical conception of destiny as opposed to willpower, at its worst the Napoleonic delusion. However, there was a paragraph that did seem to meet the case, and this I sent him. The compensation of a very early success is a conviction that life is a romantic matter. In the best sense, one stays young. When the primary objects of love and money could be taken for granted, and a shaky eminence had lost its fascination, I had fair years to waste, years that I can't honestly say I regret, in seeking the eternal carnival by the sea. Over the course of the next several years, we were still able to indulge in creative time-wasting by talking always with ardent respect, but always exhaustively until there was absolutely nothing left to say, about women, different women, and sometimes the same women. I remember being rather relieved when, of one of those women, it could be said that it was I who had featured with her, so to speak, first. It seemed only fair. And then the talk would turn to other things. Martin never let friendship take precedence over his first love, which was and is the English language. If one employed a lazy or stale phrase, it would be rubbed in. There, I've done it again. No, it would be incisively emphasized, with a curl of that mighty lip and an ironic gesture. If one committed the offence in print, I remember once saying no mean achievement in an article, the rebuke might come in note form, or by one's being handed a copy of the article with a penciled underlining. He could take this vigilance to almost parodic lengths. The words ruggedly handsome features appear on the first page of 1984, and for a while Martin declined to go any further into the book. The man can't write worth a damn. He was later to admit that the novel did improve a trifle after that. Years later, when I gave him the manuscript of my book on Orwell, he brought it to our next rendezvous at a Manhattan bistro and wordlessly handed it back. He had gone through it page by page, painstakingly correcting my pepper shaker punctuation. He seemed to have read everything, and he had the rare faculty of being able to quote longish staves of prose from memory. A passage about Sir Leicester Dedlock and gout from Bleak House, a spine-tingling rendition of Humbert Humbert's last verbal duel with Quilty, a paragraph or two about Alexander Portnoy's mother, the latter perhaps not so astonishing now I think about it. In his work as well as in his life, Martin has done the really hard thinking about hand jobs, and put us all very sincerely and gratefully in his debt. In this area, too, I felt myself the junior. It was he who got me to read Nabokov and to do so with care, as well as with awe, if only because I knew I would be asked questions. However, I was able to return the favour in a way which was to help change his life in turn, by pressing on him a copy of Humboldt's Gift. In 2008, when I finally had a bestseller hit of my own, it was from the pages of Bellow's great book that Martin sent me a sort of return compliment for my Fitzgerald telegram of 1974. It was my turn to be famous and to make money, to get heavy mail, to be recognized by influential people, to be dined at Sardi's and propositioned in padded booths by women who sprayed themselves with musk, to buy Sea Island cotton underpants and leather luggage, to live through the intolerable excitement of vindication. I was right all along. I experienced the high voltage of publicity. This, too, the Sea Island gear and the musky women, for example, was quite imperfect as an analogy while still conveying an atmosphere. Loved by women while also being adored by men, shall I say no mean achievement? Martin also has a way of attracting fathers. He once went to meet John Updike at the Massachusetts General Hospital and told me that when he'd said goodbye, it felt oddly as if waving farewell to a male parent. I happened to be interviewing Updike a year or so later, and mentioned that I knew his great admirer, the younger Amos. With an extraordinarily gentle expression on his face, Updike recalled the meeting at Mass Gen and said, "It was the strangest thing watching him walk away, almost as if he were my son." And nobody who has read Martin on Saul Bellow, let alone seen him in the company of the old man, can doubt for a second that his combination of admiring and protective feelings had eventually become fiercely filial. He said indignantly to me when I gave Bellow's Ravelstein a slightly disobliging review, "Don't cheek your elders." I waited for something else, some hint of the ironic perhaps, but with perfectly emphatic gravity he repeated the admonition. This from the one-time enfant terrible could mean only one thing. There was also a time when he might have adopted Vladimir Nabokov, posthumously as it were, as a proxy parent. He made himself master of the subject matter, got to know surviving members of the family, wrote an essay on Lolita that was frighteningly exact, did everything except take up Lepidoptera. But the more Martin absorbed himself in the man's work, the more it was borne in on him that the recurrent 12-year-old girl theme in Nabokov's writing was something more alarming and disturbing than a daring literary one-off. See, for his morally inerrant notice of this disquieting business, The Guardian of the 14th of November 2009. But I was also lucky in meeting Martin when his relationship with his true father was at its absolute best. I remember envying the way in which the two of them could tell jokes without inhibition, discuss matters sexual, and compete only over minor differences about literature or politics. There had once been a bad time when Martin and his siblings and his mother had been abandoned by the old man, and there was to come a moment when that same old man metamorphosed into an elderly man, querulous and paranoid and devoid of wit, but in between there was a wonderful golden late summer. "Dad, will you make some of your noises?" It was easy to see when this invitation was taken up, where Martin had acquired his own gift for mimicry. Kingsley could do the sound of a brass band approaching on a foggy day. He could become the Metropolitan Line train entering Edgware Road station. He could be 4 wrecked tramps coughing in a bus shelter. This was very demanding and once led to heart palpitations. To create the hiss and crackle of a wartime radio broadcast delivered by Franklin Delano Roosevelt was for him scant problem. A tape of it, indeed, was played at his memorial meeting, where I was hugely honoured to be among the speakers. The pièce de résistance, an attempt by British soldiers to start up a frozen 2-ton truck on a windy morning somewhere in Germany, was for special occasions only. One held one's breath as Kingsley emitted the first screech of the busted starting key. His only slightly lesser vocal achievement, of a motorbike yelling in mechanical agony, once caused a man who had just parked his own machine in the street to turn back anxiously and take a look. The old boy's imitation of an angry dog barking the words, "Bug off!" was note-perfect. I am aware at all times, gentle reader, of the perhaps-you-had-to-be-there element in a memoir. I strive to keep it permanently in mind. In the case of Kingsley, you don't absolutely have to have been there. Try this from one of his many wonderful letters to Philip Larkin. Amos is imitating the ingratiating announcer of the BBC's condescending weekly programme, Jazz, record requests. Archie Shepp at his most exhilarating. Now to remind us of jazz's almost infinite variety. Back almost 50 years to No Good Deaf Poxy Sam and One-Titted Woman Blues. Wah, 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 wah. Oh, I go woman, she only go one-tit. Yeah, go woman, she only go one-tit. Wah, 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 wah. Boy, if she go another, she wouldn't know where to put it. I was reading this late one night, several years after Kingsley's death, and once I'd tried it out loud a couple of times, I felt, through my hot tears of astonished laughter, that it was as if he were in the room, and he went to all this trouble for a private letter. Evenings at Kingsley's home in Flask Walk, the perfect address, were of Falstaffian proportions, with bulging sacks of takeaway food and continual raids on the rightly vaunted arsenal of his cellar. "Hitch," he said to me once, "you've been here before, and you know the rule of the house. If you don't have a drink in your hand, it's your own fault." Noises might or might not be part of the entertainment. He had a tendency to the gross, and evidently thought that a belch, say, was a terrible thing to waste. I remember his unscripted trombonings and trumpetings, his cigars and his Macallan single malt, his limericks and his charades, just as I remember sitting quietly while he talked with authority about why Jane Austen was not all that good. The word good, in all its variations, see the blues in the footnote preceding, was almost all that this man of immense vocabulary required as a shorthand critical tool. I don't know whether the concept hailed from the Newspeak dictionary in 1984, where the choices ranged from plus good to double plus ungood, but bloody good from Kingsley was authoritatively affirmative. Good was really pretty good. Some good wasn't at all bad. No good was applied very scathingly indeed, and a 3-sentence, 6-word pronouncement, which I heard him render upon Graham Greene's then latest novel, The Human Factor, absolutely no, bloody good, at all, was conclusive. I write this in a week where I have been rereading Northanger Abbey and reflecting once again on the sheer justice of Kingsley's verdict on Miss Austen's inclination to take a long time over what is of minor importance and a short time over what is major. I shall try and be brief about the sorry way in which things ended up. After I left for America, Kingsley wrote a novel called Stanley and the Women. This failed to get itself published in New York, and word reached me that objections from feminists had prevented it from getting adopted by any major house. There were also those who claimed to find it anti-Semitic, though the only offensive remarks in its pages were made by a young man who was clearly out of his mind. I launched a campaign in my column in the Times Literary Supplement against what was just then becoming widely known as political correctness. I kept on being boring about this until eventually I received a letter from an editor, a Jewish woman as it happened, who said in effect, "Okay, you win. We'll save the honour of publishing by doing Stanley." Kingsley, whom I hadn't seen for years, invited me to a celebration of this small victory on my next visit to London. We were to meet at the Garrick Club, be joined by Martin, see a movie, and then have a lavish dinner. I still shrink from recalling it. As soon as I arrived at the Garrick's bar, he told me a joke I'd heard before and could obviously see that it hadn't worked. His choice of film was an Eddie Murphy insult that seemed to contradict his increasing contempt for American culture. He appeared genuinely offended that we thought so little of it. Martin and I kept nervously behaving as if he must somehow be joking. "Flawless masterpiece," he kept energetically insisting. And this was a mistake. Not only was he not joking, he was in every other way failing to be amusing. In an alarming reversal of his earlier Falstaffianism, he also managed to look both corpulent and resentful. Surfeit swelled, to be sure, but quite without mirth. I think he may have managed one of his riffs about Nelson Mandela being a terrorist. Most painful of all, and somehow rendering rather pointless the original point of the evening, he had abandoned his old liking of the United States and passed the test of the true reactionary by becoming a sulphurous anti-American. Every modern American novelist, he ended up by telling Martin once, and subverting my defence of him, is either a Jew or a hick. I was never to see King as again, and when I was almost the only person given kindly treatment in his notorious memoirs, felt oddly discriminated against. That last evening of ours was the very definition of having no fun. We were no longer drawing on a common store of comic gags and literary allusions. I boldly assert, in fact I think I know, that a lot of friendships and connections absolutely depend upon a sort of shared language or slang. Not necessarily designed to exclude others, these can establish a certain comity and, even after a long absence, re-establish it in a second. Martin is, a genius at this sort of thing. It arises, from his willingness to devote real time to the pitiless search for the apt resonance. I don't know quite why this lodges in my mind, but we once went to some grand black tie ball that had been slightly over-advertised and proved disappointing. The following morning he rang me. I found the way to describe the men at that horror show last evening. Tuxed fucks. As this will illustrate, he did not scorn the demotic or the American. In fact, he remains almost unique in the way that he can blend pub talk and mid-Atlantic idiom into paragraphs and pages that are also fully aware of Milton and Shakespeare. I am morally certain that it's this combination of the classical with the wised-up and street-smart, most conspicuously with Augie March, that made it a sure thing that he and Saul Bellow would one day take each other's hands. Martin had a period of relishing the Boston thug writer George V. Higgins, author of The Friends of Eddie Coyle. Higgins's characters had an infectious way of saying inner and honour, so Martin would say, for example, I think this lunch should be on a hitch, or I heard he wasn't that useful in a sack. Simple pleasures, you may say, but linguistic sinew is acquired in this fashion, and he would not dump a trope until he'd chewed all the flesh and pulp of it and was left only with pith and pips. Thus there arrived a day when Park Lane played host to a fancy new American hotel with the no less fancy name of the Inn on the Park, and he suggested a high-priced cocktail there for no better reason than that he could instruct the cab driver to park in an inn on a park. This near palindrome, as I now think of it, gave us much innocent pleasure. Not all of our pleasures were innocent. There came the day when we were both in New York and both beginning to feel the long, strong, gravitational pull of the great American planet, but where a slight chore meanwhile required itself to be performed. In the mid-term churnings of what was to become his breakout novel, Money, Martin required his character to visit a brothel or bordello. He even had one all picked out. Its front name was the Tahisha, a dire, Polynesian-themed massage parlour on Lower Lexington Avenue. And you, he informed me, are fucking well coming with me. I was later rather startled, not to say impressed, when I learned that he had cleared all this research with his then-wife, the fragrant and lofty Antonia. He telephoned her in London, and rather than temporize, informed her right away that I'm going to a hand-job parlour with the Hitch. I wanted to say something girlish like, have I ever refused you anything? But instead settled for something rather more masculine like, do we know the form at this joint? I could not possibly have felt less like any such expedition. I had a paint-stripping hangover and a sour mouth, but he had that look of set purpose on his face that I well knew, and also knew could not be gainsaid. How bad could it be? Pretty damn bad, as it turned out. Of the numerous regrettable elements that go to make up the unlawful carnal knowledge industry, I should single out for distinction the look of undisguised contempt that is often worn on the faces of its female staff. Some of the working hostesses may have to simulate delight or even interest, itself a pretty cock-shrivelling thought. But when these same ladies do the negotiating, they can shrug off the fake charm as a snake discards an unwanted skin. I suppose they know or presume that they've already got the despised male client exactly where they want him. As it happens, this wasn't true in our case. I would gladly have paid not to have sex at this point, and Martin needed only to snap his fingers in order to enjoy female company. But the cynical little witches at the Tahisha were not to know that they were being conscripted into the service of literature. It was well said by Jean Tarou in The Plague, I think, that attendance at lectures in an unknown language will help to hone one's awareness of the exceedingly slow passage of time. I once had the experience of being waterboarded and can now dimly appreciate how much every second counts in the experience of the torture victim, forced to go on enduring what is unendurable. But not even the lapse of time between then and now has numbed my recollection of how truly horrible it was to be faking interest in someone who was being paid, and paid rather more incidentally than I could afford, to feign a contemptuous interest in me. The multiplier effect of this mutual degradation gave me dry heaves and flop sweats, and, I began to fear, conveyed the entirely misleading impression of my being a customer who was convulsed by the hectic sickness of lust. The seconds went limping and dragging by on absolutely leaden feet. It was the cash question, though, that saved me. With some presence of mind, I had for once preempted Martin in the bar of the dump, where the gruesome selection process began, by swiftly pointing to the prettiest and slenderest of those available, who also possessed one of the most vicious-looking smiles I've ever seen on a human face. Once removed to her sinister cubicle, we commenced to bargain, or rather in a sort of squalid reverse haggle. Every time I agreed to the price, she added some tax or impost or surcharge and bid me higher. Clad by now only in some sort of exiguous sarong and equipped only with a dank Ziploc bag containing my credit cards and money, one was obliged to check everything else before entering the humid bar. I wearily started to count out the ever-steepening fee, which was the only thing in the room that showed any sign of enlarging itself. It turned out that, what with tips and percentages and what not, the avaricious bitch had contrived a figure that was not just more than I could afford, but more than I had on me. I was down to the quarters and nickels, and it showed. She had, I will say for her, more pride than that. A handful of change thrown in? No. No one can be expected to take this. So I took her cue of rage and stood up with about as much self-esteem as I could wrap around myself. Here was a two-faced coin of luck. I not only didn't have to go through with it, but I didn't have to shell out the dough either. I lurked torpidly in the recovery room, or whatever they call it, and was eventually joined by a rather reduced and chastened Martin. If you want to know what happened to him, the whole experience enriched and enhanced by what I confessed to him of what had happened to me, you must read pages 98 to 104 of the Penguin edition of Money, where John Self tries to get laid for pay, under the bam, under the boo, at a perfectly foul establishment named the Happy Isles. There are many, many reasons why Money is the great English novel of the 1980s, to which I am able to add this ensuing insight. Out of our grim little encounter, where he, poor bastard, actually had to part with the cash and endure a sexual fiasco, came several paragraphs of pure reality-based fantasy that make me twist and snarl with laughter every time. And no, you most definitely did not have to have been there. We went off to recuperate at a lunch with Jane Bonham Carter and Ian Lefrene, at which I remember using hot Japanese sake, by no means for the first time, as an expedient solvent for my still clinging hangover. Seldom can a mid-morning have been so ill-spent yet, which perhaps goes to show, seldom can such rank dissipation have yielded so many dividends on the page. In all of Martin's fiction one finds this same keen relish for and appreciation of the multiple uses of embarrassment. The bite of his wit redeems this from being mere farce or humiliation. When fused with his high seriousness about language, the effect is truly formidable. He once rebuked some pedantic antagonist by saying that the man lacked any sense of humour, but added that by this accusation he really intended to impugn his want of seriousness. In a completely other incarnation, I've often thought that he would have made a terrifying barrister. Once decided on mastering a brief, whether it be in his work on nuclear weapons, The Final Solution, or the Gulag, he would go off and positively saturate himself in the literature, and you could always tell that there was a work in progress when all his conversation began to orient itself to the master theme. In this he strangely resembled Perry Anderson, the theoretician of New Left Review, with whom I also became friendly at about this time. Perry's encyclopedism extended well beyond ideology. He introduced me to the great social comedy of Anthony Pole's dance sequence, of which he possesses a matchless understanding. Like Perry, Martin contrived to do this without becoming monomaniacal or Ancient Mariner-like. There was a time when he wouldn't have known the difference between Bukharin and Bakunin, and his later writing on Marxism gets quite a few things wrong, including some things about me and about James Fenton. Uncharacteristically for Martin, his labour on the great subject of communism is also highly deficient in lacking a tragic sense. But he still passed the greatest of all tests in being a pleasure to argue with. Back to my point about shared language, this gradual thickening of mutual experience became its own patois, as Money shows. Only recently I found myself smirking in a foolish manner, as a New York Times profile of Martin referred to the words rug for hairdo and sock for loathsomely inadequate bachelor accommodations that he'd popularized for a generation. I played my own small part in this, with sock, as I recall, as also with the then overused word rethink, to describe any wearisomely necessary and repetitive activity, such as a haircut or a bathroom trip. But it was not until Martin had put it into circulation that a coinage of this sort could hope to acquire any real currency. The only time that he ever seemed at all literal to me was in his absorption with soccer games. He would even buy tabloid newspapers on the following day, to read accounts of previously played football matches, as I tried discouragingly to put it. From him I learned to accept, as I have since learned to accept from my son and my godson Jacob Amis and their friends, that there are men to whom the outcome of such sporting engagements is emotionally important. This is a test of masculinity, like some straight men's fascination with lesbianism, which I simply cannot seem to pass. Something should be said of the Friday lunch that has now become the potential stuff of a new Bloomsbury legend. I find I want to try and limit myself on this subject, because the temptation to be in ought to be resisted, and also because in this instance you probably did indeed have to be there. I also bear in mind what Fenton once told me about the first Bloomsbury. In the early days of tape recording, it was decided to make a secret tape of the brilliant conversation of Raymond Mortimer and others. All who were in on the plan were later agreed that Mortimer and the others had been at their most scintillating on the afternoon concerned, but when replayed, the tape was as dull as rain. So the first thing to say about this luncheon circle was that, like Topsy in the old folk story, it just growed. There was never the intention or design that it become a set or a circle, and of course if there had been any such intention, the thing would have been abortive. The Friday lunch began to simply occur in the mid-1970s and persisted into the early 1980s, and is now cemented in place in several memoirs and biographies. Let me try and tell you something of how it was. It began largely at Martin's initiation as a sort of end-of-the-week clearinghouse for gossip and jokes, based on the then proximity of various literary magazines and newspapers. Reliable founding attendees included the Australian poets Clive James and Peter Porter, Craig Raine, T.S. Eliot's successor as poetry editor at Faber and Faber, the Observer's literary editor Terry Kilmartin, the retranslator of Scott Moncrief's version of Marcel Proust, and the only man alive trusted by Gore Vidal to edit his copy without further permission, the cartoonist and rake and dandy Mark Boxer, whose illustrations then graced, for once the word is quite apt, all the best book covers as well as the Times' op-ed page. Among those book covers were the dozen volumes of Anthony Pole's masterwork, and, among Mark's aesthetic and social verdicts, the one I remember being delivered with the most authority was his decided and long-meditated conclusion that it's the height of bad manners to sleep with somebody less than 3 times. Once, planning a party with Martin and myself, he'd completed the formal task of inviting all those who simply had to be asked, and exclaimed with relief and delight, "From now on, we should go on the basis of looks alone." The critic Russell Davis, the then-rising novelists Ian McEwan and Julian Barnes, James Fenton and Robert Conquest when they were in England, Kingsley when he wasn't otherwise engaged with yet more lavish and extensive lunches, and your humble servant helped to complete this dramatis personae. There were no women, or no regular ones, and nothing was ever said or explicitly resolved about this fact. Between us we were believed to control a lot of the reviewing space in London, and much envious and paranoid comment was made then, and has been made since, to the effect that we vindicated or confirmed Dr. F.R. Leavis's nightmare of a conspiratorial London literary establishment. But I can only remember one occasion when a book was brought along to lunch, to be given to me, so that I could fill in for some reviewer who'd failed at the last moment, and I truly don't think that this counts. Time spent on recollecting our little Bohemia confirms 3 related but contrasting things for me. The first was the pervasive cultural influence of Philip Larkin. The second was the importance of word games and the long, exhaustive process that makes them both live and become worthwhile. The third was the gradual but ineluctable rise of Margaret Thatcher and her transatlantic counterpart Ronald Reagan. These, then, will be my excuses and pretexts for letting in daylight upon magic, as Walter Bagehot phrased it. Unspoken in our circle was quite a deep divide between left and, if not exactly right, yet increasingly anti-left. Fenton and I were still quite Marxist in our own way, even if our cohort was of the heterodox type that I tried to describe earlier. Kingsley had become increasingly vocally right-wing, it often seeming to outsiders that he was confusing the state of the country with the condition of his own liver. But please see his diaries of the time to notice how cogent he often still was. Clive and Martin had been hugely impressed, as who indeed had not, by the emergence of Alexander Solzhenitsyn as a moral and historical titan, witnessing for truth against the state-sponsored lie. In between, men like Terry and Mark found it difficult to repudiate their dislike for a Tory party that had been the main enemy in their youth. Robert Conquest was, and still is, the most distinguished and authoritative anti-communist and ex-communist writing in English. But if this subject was excluded, his politics tended towards something fairly equably social democratic in temper. He and I agreed that the Moscow Olympics should be boycotted after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and of course it was he who noticed that some of the aquatic events were being held in the Baltic states, the Russian annexation of which had never been recognized by the post-Yalta agreements that defined the Cold War. At the last lunch I ever attended before emigrating for the United States, a toast was raised to Bob's impending fourth, or was it fifth, marriage. "Well," he replied modestly, "I thought perhaps one for the road." Philip Larkin wrote gloomily to Kingsley that the new Texan spouse would probably make their old friend move permanently to America, as Yank bags do. And so indeed it proved. Elizabeth, or Liddy, is a bit more than the other half. She's a great scholar in her own person and the anchor of one of the most successful late marriages on record. Once Martin and I had also married Americans, she printed a T-shirt for all concerned that read, "Yank Bags Club." I learned appreciably from registering the cross-currents that underlay this apparently light but really quite serious lunch. Our common admiration for Larkin, as a poet if not as a man, arose from the bleak honesty with which he confronted the fucked up, the expression must be allowed, condition of the country in those years. It was his use of that phrase, "they fuck you up, your mum and dad," as the opening line of his masterly "This Be the Verse," that put him outside the pale of the family values community. At one of my first encounters with Martin, when we discovered a common affinity for the man, I put my own main emphasis on his poem Going, Going, which was a non-lachrymose elegy for the seaside and countryside of England, increasingly vandalized and paved and polluted by a combination of plebeian little-outs and polluting capitalists. The poem had actually been commissioned by the Tory government of Edward Heath to accompany the publication of a white paper on the environment, but had then been censored because of a verse about the greedy businessmen who filled the estuaries with effluent. Larkin's innate pessimism, his loyalty to the gritty northern town of Hull, where lay the provincial university that employed him, and his hilarious interest in filth of all kinds, were attractive to all of us, likewise his very moving, deliberate refusal of the false consolations of religion, beautifully captured by his Aubade and church-going, on which not even Kingsley disagreed. However, Larkin's pungent loathing for the left, for immigrants, for striking workers, for foreigners, and indeed abroad, and for London, showed that you couldn't have everything. From Larkin's own emphatic use of it, a common enough idiom, that of the fool, was also evolved, so as to try and make it as capacious as Kingsley's variation on the ordinary word good. Thus there were, of course, and as ever in English, plain fools and damn fools. But trying extra hard to be stupid could get you bloody fool, and real excellence and application in the willful led to the summa of fucking fool. This last title corresponded to Orwell's definition of something so simultaneously dumb and sinister that only an intellectual could be capable of uttering it. One lunchtime attempt to draw up a fucking fool's first 11 of current greats attracted various nominations, John Berger being unanimously chosen as captain. As for the word games, just bear with me if you would. Try first turning the word house into sock. OK. Bleak sock, heartbreak sock, the fall of the sock of Usher, the sock of Atreus, the sock of the Seven Gables, the sock of the rising sun. This can take time, as can the substitution, a very common English vulgarism, of the word cunt for the word man. Thus, a cunt for all seasons. A cunt's a cunt for all that. He was a cunt, taking for all in all. The cunt who shot Liberty Valance, bat cunt, super cunt. I know, but one must keep the pot boiling. And then, all right, a shift to the only hardly less coarse word prong, as in the prong with the golden gun, our prong in Havana, prongs without women, those magnificent prongs in their flying machines, and so forth. These and other similarly gruelling routines had to be rolled around the palate and the tongue many a time before Clive James suddenly exclaimed, "A Shropshire cunt," by A.E. Sockprong. This symbiosis seemed somehow to make the long interludes of puerility worthwhile. Clive was in some ways the chief whip of the lunch and would often ring round to make sure that there was a quorum, though I noticed that whenever Martin was away, his enthusiasm waned a bit, as did everyone else's. He needed an audience and damn well deserved one. He beautifully illustrated my Peter de Vries point by having an absolutely massive following on television, while slaving until dawn in Cambridge to produce gem-like essays for no-readership magazines like The New Review, or, as his later anthologies of criticism and poetry have amazingly proven, for no immediate audience except himself, a fairly exacting one at that. His authority with the hyperbolic metaphor is, I think, unchallenged. Arnold Schwarzenegger in Pumping Iron resembled a brown condom stuffed with walnuts. Of an encounter with some boar with famous halitosis, Clive once announced, "By this time his breath was undoing my tie." I well remember the day when he delivered his review of Leonid Brezhnev's memoirs to the New Statesman, and Martin read its opening paragraphs out loud. "Here is a book so dull that a whirling dervish could read himself to sleep with it. If it were to be read in the open air, birds would fall stunned from the sky." One could hear his twanging, marsupial tones in his scorn for this world-class drone and bully, whose work was being published by the ever-servile and mercenary tycoon, Robert Maxwell, one of the Labour Party's many sources of shame. Clive had given up alcohol after a long period of enjoying a master-servant relationship with it, in which, unfortunately, the role of the booze had been played by Dirk Bogarde. He thus threw in money only for the food part of the bill, until one day he noticed how much the restaurant charged for awful muck such as bitter lemon and tonic water. At this he moaned with theatrical remorse, "I owe you all several £100." But not all was geniality and verve. The only rift in the Friday loot came when Clive took huge exception to Fenton's review of his actually quite bad verse play about the rise of Prince Charles. The expression complained of, I seem to recall, was, "This is the worst poem of the 20th century." The ensuing chill went on for a bit. Egil Gluckstein, the theoretical guru of the International Socialists, whose party name was Tony Cliff, used to tell an anecdote that I came to regard as an analogy for this sort of wordplay. Rosa Luxemburg, our heroine in the struggle against German imperialism, and the woman who had told Lenin that the right to free expression was meaningless unless it was the right of the person who thinks differently, had once satirized the overcautious work of the German reformists and trade unionists as the labour of Sisyphus. Whenever she approached the podium of the Social Democratic conventions before 1914, and before they proved her right by siding with the filthy Kaiser on the crucial vote for war, she would be jeered at as she moved her lamed body towards the platform and catcalled as Sisyphus by the union hacks. "So maybe Sisyphus was wasting his time," Gluckstein would say, hesitating for emphasis. "But maybe from this he still got some good muscles." If this historico-materialist point could be adapted for literary weight-training purposes, I would feel compelled to place on record the marginal question of the Tupper family. Everything depended in this otherwise undistinguished imaginary dynasty on your nickname. Thus you might be an overeager salesman known to his colleagues as Pushy Tupper. You might even be a pedantic and donnish fellow saddled with the tag of Stuffy Tupper. The opium addict Poppy was about as far as most of us were prepared to last on this short-lived expedition. But Robert Conquest, the king of the Limerick, and the dragon slayer of the Stalinoid apologists, always thought that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing well. He went off and brooded and came back with Whirly Tupper, the helicopter pioneer, as well as the two hopeless boozers, Whiskey and indeed Rye Tupper. Ought one to blush and to admit that some of these went straight into print as the questions and answers of the New Statesman weekend competition? Well, so did other things no less trivial that are now the stuff of New Yorker profiles, such as new equivalents for the old phrase, cruising for a bruising, angling for a mangling, aiming for a maiming, strolling for a rolling, and, my own favourite, thirsting for a worsting. There was also the time that competitors were asked to submit a paragraph of a Graham Greene parody. Greene himself entered under a pseudonym and placed third. More demanding still was the restless quest, again chiefly led by Conquest, to inscribe the names of obscure and lowly, unenviable, and ultimately poorly rewarded occupations. Thus, one employed as a disciplinarian of last resort in the turbulent kitchen, cooksacker; as a disciplinarian of last resort in an ill-run lunatic asylum, kooksocker; as the man in the bottling plant who keeps things moist, cork soaker. as a sectarian pyromaniac in the Scots Wars of Religion, Kirksacker, as one who has the lonely task of interrupting boat races by leaning over the bridge to snatch up the steersman, with rod and line, Coxhooker. Simple versified filth, Amos Senior's crushing condemnation of most popular limericks, was not allowed. Indeed, insistence upon the capacious subtleties of the limerick was something of a hallmark. Once again Conquest takes the palm. His condensation of the 7 ages of man shows how much force can be compressed into the deceptively slight 5-line frame. Thus, 7 ages, first puking and mewling, then very pissed off with your schooling, then fucks, and then fights, next judging chaps' rights, then sitting in slippers, then drooling. This is not the only example of Conquest's genius for compression. The history of the Bolshevik experiment in 5 lines? Barely a problem. There was an old bastard named Lenin who did 2 or 3 million men in. That's a lot to have done in. But where he did 1 in, that old bastard Stalin did 10 in. One of Kingsley's letters from this period may show the way things were tending, and certainly makes me remember the atmosphere as it then was. He's writing to Robert Conquest on April 7, 1977. The swing to the right here is putting the wind up the lefties. At the Friday lunch the other day, they, chiefly Hitchens and Fenton, were saying that chaps were getting fed up about stuff that may not be Labour's fault, but is associated with them rather than the Tories. Porn and permissiveness generally, comprehensivization, TUC bosses, terrorism, and the defence rundown. In cultural political terms, that's much as I remember it myself. An expiring post-war Labour consensus, increasingly dependent upon tax-funded statism, yet actually run by the union-based old-line right wing of the Labour Party machine. A Weimar without the sex, as I once tried to phrase it at the time, except that in the rest of society there was sex aplenty, with the hedonism of the 60s almost officially instated as dogma, and the slow, surreptitious growth of this consensus to the then unguessed-at status of correctness. There could have been no bad time to meet him, but this in retrospect seems to have been the perfect moment to become acquainted with Ian McEwan. It was Martin who brought us together, Ian having succeeded him as the winner of the Somerset Maugham Award. By then, everyone had been mesmerised by Ian's early collections of short stories, First Love, Last Rites, and In Between the Sheets. Met in person, he seemed at first to possess some of the same vaguely unsettling qualities as his tales. He never raised his voice, surveyed the world in a very level and almost affectless fashion through moon-shaped granny glasses, wore his hair in a fringe, was rail-thin, showed an interest in what Martin used to call hippie-ish pursuits, and when I met him, was choosing to live on the fringes of the then weed-infested frontline black ghetto in Brixton. What he wrote, you could see, as Clive James put it when using Ian's character in a novel. And when it came to fiction, he seemed to have contact with other remoter spheres. He could and still can, for example, write about childhood and youth with an almost eerie ability to think and feel his way back into it, a faculty that many superb writers are unable to recruit in themselves. I was sitting at my New Statesman desk one afternoon when the telephone rang and a strange voice asked for me by name. After I had confirmed that it was indeed me, or I, the voice said, "This is Thomas Pynchon speaking." I am glad that I did not say what I first thought of saying, because he was soon enough able to demonstrate that it was him, and that a mutual friend, make that a common friend, named Ian McEwan, had suggested that he call. The book of still another friend, Larry Kramer's ultra-homosexual effort, Faggots, had been seized by the British Customs and Excise, and all the impounded copies were in danger of being destroyed. Mr. Pynchon was somewhere in England, and was mightily distressed by this. What could be done? Could I raise an outcry, as Pynchon had been assured by Ian I could? I told him that one could protest hoarsely and long, but that Britain had no law protecting free speech, or forbidding state censorship. We chatted a bit longer. I artlessly offered to call him back. He laughingly declined this transparent try-on, and faded back into the world where only McEwan could find him. Ian seemed to be able to manage this sort of thing without ever boasting of it. He also formed a friendship with the almost impossible-to-find Milan Kundera. From this you may surmise that Ian was not part of any pronounced drift to the political or cultural right, but nor was he someone who'd stopped reflecting at approximately the time of Woodstock. His father had been a regular officer in a Scottish regiment, He had a serious working knowledge of military history. His love of the natural world and of wildlife, leading to the arduously contemplative hikes about which we teased him, was matched by an interest in the hard sciences. I think that he did at one stage in his life dabble a bit in what's loosely called the New Age, but in the end it was the rigorous side that won out, and his novels are almost always patrolling some difficult frontier between the speculative and the unseen, and the ways in which material reality reimposes itself. When not talking with penetration about literature and music, he was in himself an acute register of the stresses, cultural and moral, that were remaking the old British political divide. One day, or actually one night, I made another saunter across the bridge of that divide in order to test the temperature and conditions on the other side. The circumstances could hardly have been more propitious for me. The Tories were having a reception in the Rosebery Room of the House of Lords in order to launch a crusty old book by a crusty old peer named Lord Butler, and there was a rumour that the newly elected female leader of the Conservative Party would be among those present for the cocktails. I had written a longish article for the New York Times Magazine, saying in effect that if Labour could not revolutionise British society, then the task might well fall to the right. I had also written a shorter piece for the New Statesman, reporting from the Conservative Party conference and saying in passing that I thought Mrs. Thatcher was surprisingly sexy. To this day, I've never had so much anger mail, saying in effect, "How could you?" I felt immune to Mrs. Thatcher in most other ways, since for all her glib free market advocacy on one front, she seemed to be an emotional ally of the authoritarian and protectionist white settler regime in Rhodesia. And it was this very thing that afforded me the opportunity to grapple with her so early in her career. At the party was Sir Peregrine Worsthorne, a poised and engaging chap, with whom I'd had many debates in Rhodesia itself, both at the celebrated colonial bar of Meikle's Hotel and in other more rugged locations. I'd even taken him to meet Sir Roy Walensky, the tough old right-wing white trade unionist and former Prime Minister of Rhodesia, who had broken with the treasonous pro-apartheid riffraff around Ian Smith. "It's always seemed perfectly simple to me, Mr. Worsthorne," this old bulldog growled in the unmistakable accent of the region. "If you don't like black men, then don't come and live in Africa." Perry had granted the justice of this, as how could he not, and now felt that he owed me a small service in return. "Care to meet the new leader?" Who could refuse? Within moments, Margaret Thatcher and I were face to face. Within moments, too, I had turned away and was showing her my buttocks. I suppose that I must give some sort of explanation for this. Almost as soon as we shook hands on immediate introduction, I felt that she knew my name and had perhaps connected it to the Socialist Weekly that had recently called her rather sexy. While she struggled adorably with this moment of pretty confusion, I felt obliged to seek controversy, and picked a fight with her on a detail of Rhodesia-Zimbabwe policy. She took me up on it. I was, as it chances, right, on the small point of fact, and she was wrong, but she maintained her wrongness with such adamantine strength that I eventually conceded the point and even bowed slightly to emphasize my acknowledgement. "No," she said, "bow lower." Smiling agreeably, I bent forward a bit further. "No," she trilled, "much lower." By this time, a little group of interested bystanders was gathering. I again bent forward, this time much more self-consciously. Stepping around behind me, she unmasked her batteries and smote me on the rear with the parliamentary order paper that she had been rolling into a cylinder behind her back. I regained the vertical with some awkwardness. As she walked away, she looked back over her shoulder and gave an almost imperceptibly slight roll of the hip while mouthing the words, "Naughty boy." I had and have eyewitnesses to this. At the time, though, I hardly believed it myself. It's only from a later perspective, looking back on the manner in which she slaughtered and cowed all the former male leadership of her party and replaced them with pliant tools, that I appreciate the premonitory glimpse of what someone in another context once called the smack of firm government that I had been afforded. Even at the time, as I left that party, I knew I had met someone rather impressive. And the worst of Thatcherism, as I was beginning by degrees to discover, was the rodent slowly stirring in my viscera, the uneasy but unbanishable feeling that on some essential matters she might be right. Portugal to Poland. In retrospect, it seems to have been more conscious on my part than perhaps it was at the time, but there came a stage where I took refuge in travel. To adapt what Cavafy says about the barbarians, this was a solution of various kinds. It removed me from a London that was often dank and second-rate. It kindled in me a resolution which I've tried to keep ever since, to spend at least once every year a little time in a country less fortunate than my own. If this doesn't stop you getting fat, it can at least help prevent you from getting too soft. And, in the period I'm writing about, it allowed me to continue seeing the left as a force that was still struggling for first principles against the traditional foes. I would be indignant if anyone were to describe this as romantic, a term that we were especially educated to despise in the International Socialists, even though I do now think that there may be more reprehensible words. But if you exempt a solidarity trip that I took to express support for the Icelandic socialists who were fighting to stop British trawlers from hoovering up all their fish, and Iceland is an exotic locale all of its own, with its moonscape interior and geyser-supplied hot water with the ever-present diabolical whiff of sulphur, it is true that the impulse generally led me to the south and to the Mediterranean and to the Levant. One of the many great hopes of 1968 had been to complete the unfinished business of the Second World War and cleanse Spain and Portugal of their antique fascist regimes. Not only had this ambition not been realized, but another dictatorship of the right had been imposed on Greece and then spread with calamitous results to the independent Republic of Cyprus. The drama extended across both sides of the Pillars of Hercules. Franco's Spain made a free gift of its Western Sahara colonial possession to the absolutist monarchy in Morocco, leaving the population voiceless in its own destiny. It also extended to the extreme opposite end of the Mediterranean, where an Israeli-Jewish opposition to the occupation of Palestinian land was beginning to take shape, and where in Lebanon an alliance of secular and Palestinian forces was emerging to challenge the old confession-based hierarchy. A whole anthology of images survives vividly in my mind from this time. A spontaneous riot on the broad Ramblas of Barcelona after the last ever use of the hideous medieval garrote for the judicial murder of a Catalan anarchist named Salvador Puig Antich, the illegal Catalan flag proudly flown, and a shower of gasoline bombs falling on Franco's military police. A journey to Guernica, a place name that I could hardly believe corresponded to an actual living town, to rendezvous with Basque activists. A weekend in the Latin Quarter in Paris, complete with telephone passwords and anonymous handshakes in corner zinc bars, so that I could meet a Portuguese resistance leader named Palma Inácio, who was engaged in organizing an armed battle against the dictatorship in Lisbon. Some long, hot and fragrant days in Tyre and Sidon and points south of Beirut, meeting with militants of the Democratic Front who, over lunch in the olive groves, would patiently explain to me that Jews and Arabs were brothers under the skin, and that only imperialism was really the problem. Standing in Freedom Square in Nicosia, among a roaring crowd of demonstrators, many of whom had recently fought with gun in hand against the Greek junta's attempt to annex Cyprus, but whose voices could also be heard over the impermeable wall that the invading Turkish army had built right across a free city. I liked all this for its elemental headiness. It seemed to go so well with different blends of wine and raki, but also for its seriousness, politics in these latitudes being a game played for keeps, and for its immediate and intense connection to history. I felt I knew the Ramblers from Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. In Algiers, after returning from an expedition with the Polisario guerrillas fighting in the Sahara, I thought I also had at least a vicarious glimpse of the continuation of an old struggle for the soul of North Africa that had once involved Camus and Sartre. As for Cyprus, where I fell so hard in love with the island and the people, and with the very place names, Famagusta, Larnaca, Limassol, Kyrenia, and with one very dramatic and life-altering Cypriot, was not the Philhellenic tradition the very one that had helped revive British radicalism more than a century before? Today I want to puke when I hear the word radical applied so slothfully and stupidly to Islamist murderers, the most plainly reactionary people in the world. The alteration of perspective was the most useful thing. In Northern Europe it was, roughly speaking, a case of the Free West versus the satellite states of the East. In Cyprus, though, the illegal occupying power was a member of NATO. In Portugal, the fascist regime itself was a member of NATO, likewise in the case of Greece. In Spain, the main external relationship of the system was with Washington. Thus it was possible to meet communists who, in these special circumstances, not only made sense but had heroic records and were respected popular figures. In Cyprus, at a very red flag rally where I was among the platform speakers, I had the distinct honour of shaking the hand of Manolis Gledzos, who had given the signal for revolt in Athens in 1944 by climbing up the Parthenon and tearing the swastika flag from the pediment. Not a bad day's work, I think you'll agree. A comparable, if not equivalent consideration sometimes applied in the other case. For all his indomitable moral courage, Solzhenitsyn had already begun to show signs of being an extreme Russian nationalist and partisan of religious orthodoxy. The synthesis for which one aimed was the Orwellian one of evolving a consistent and integral anti-totalitarianism. However, of Comrade Glezos, it also had to be said that he had once run a bookstore in Athens that largely featured the work of Enver Hoxha of Albania, possibly the most Aztec-like of all Europe's remaining Stalinists. And I hadn't forgotten the second great promise of 1968, which was that of solidarity with the forces of dissent in the other Europe, the nations of the East and the Baltic, who'd been stranded and frozen in time ever since the Yalta Agreement permitted the partition of the continent. Thus, for me, the three most important episodes from this epoch are the stirrings of revolution in Portugal and in Poland, and the experience of counter-revolution in Argentina. Lusitania. Mediterranean though it can feel, Portugal is the only European country that has the Atlantic Ocean lapping around the inner harbour of its capital city. Its amazing mariners took its oddly inflected language as far away as East Timor and Macau, though King Henry the Navigator probably never actually boarded a ship. As soon as I could manage it after the revolution of April 1974, I arrived ordinarily enough by air and was then told to wait in the customs area. Was I perhaps on some list of undesirables, as I had found myself to be at other airports? A lanky, white-haired official, proffering a card that proclaimed his name to be Vieira da Fonseca, just like the delicious port wine, extended a hand. He was to escort me to a hotel. It appeared that I was an honoured guest. For the first time in my life, I was on a list of desirables. When the files of the former secret police of the Salazar-Caetano dictatorship had been broken open, it was found that I was listed as a particular foe of the Ancien Regime. Having imagined myself dossing down happily with my comrades on the floor of some left-wing slum apartment, I was promoted to a fairly elevated floor of the Tivoli Hotel on the Avenida Libertad, with a view of the city's captivating harbour. It all seemed too much, as if one had suddenly received the profits and dividends of an investment that had barely been made. I formed a private resolution not to become too used to it. But the fall of fascism in Lisbon in April 1974 was the occasion for an almost perfect storm of radical desires. The overthrow of the Caetano dictatorship was not only part of the long-postponed business of cleansing Europe of pre-1939 fascism, it was also a sort of revenge for the destruction in the preceding autumn, on 11th September to be precise, of the Allende government in Chile. There were other happy convergences at work also. With the old gang removed, the grip of Portugal on its African colonies was broken, and this meant not only the emancipation of Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, but also an acceleration of the process that would eventually terminate racist rule in Rhodesia and South Africa. Other revolutionary ripple effects might be expected in Portuguese-speaking Brazil, the largest and in some ways the most vicious of the authoritarian military regimes of the southern cone of the Americas, while the effect on neighbouring Spain surely had to be a demoralising one from the viewpoint of Franco's military and religious allies. A whole series of fault lines radiated away from this Lisbon earthquake, all of them shivering the structures of traditional order, and this was simply to speak politically. The cultural element made it seem as if the best of 1968 was still relevant. One of the precipitating pre-revolutionary moments had been the publication of a feminist manifesto by three women, all of whom were named Maria, and the three Marias became an exciting example of what womanhood could do when faced with a theocratic oligarchy that had treated them as breeding machines not far advanced above the level of chattel. Sex, long repressed, was to be scented very strongly on the wind. I remember in particular the only partly satirical Movimento da Esquerda Libidinosa, or Movement of the Libidinous Left, with its slogan, Somos un partido sexocrático, whose evident objective was the frantic making up of lost time. The best revolutionary poster I saw, perhaps the best I have ever seen, expressed this same thought in a rather less erotic way. It showed a modest Portuguese family in traditional dress, being introduced to a receiving line of new friends who included Socrates, Einstein, Beethoven, Spinoza, Shakespeare, Charlie Chaplin, Louis Armstrong, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. There are many people in much richer countries who are still putting off this rendezvous. As well as being a colonial power, Portugal under fascism had managed also to let itself become a semi-colony, whose main export was cheap labour to the rest of Europe, and whose illiteracy rate was about 30%. The resulting division of the country between the boss class and the officer class and the rank and file was very striking. The astounding thing, in the mass demonstrations that thronged the Avenida Libertad and the Rocio Square, was to see the squads of uniformed young sailors and soldiers joining in with the workers and the students. To my eyes, an almost literal replay of the scenes from Battleship Potemkin or the storming of the Winter Palace. And, once I'd cleared my eyes by drying them, I noticed that the parallel with St. Petersburg could be drawn in other ways too. In 1968, the ferment of revolution had taken the ossified French Communist Party completely aback, forcing it in effect to line up with de Gaulle. This it had done partly to protect its position as the party of order, and partly to obey Soviet instructions that the anti-NATO and anti-American regime of the Gaullists be left as far as possible unmolested. In Portugal, no such inhibitions were in play, because the old order had irretrievably vanished like breath off a razor blade, and there was a good old-fashioned power vacuum, or, as we used to say in factional meetings, a situation of dual power. Workers' committees were forming embryo Soviets. Soldiers and sailors' collectives had whole ships and regiments under their temporary command. Landless workers in the countryside were taking over abandoned farms and properties. There were two things to notice about this. One was that hardly a shot was fired. The Portuguese may have exported a good deal of their violence overseas to Africa, but in the country itself the rhythms were, when compared to neighbouring Spain, say, remarkably gentle. As a possible metaphor, in Portuguese bullfights the bull is not tortured or killed. The matador tests only his own agility and bravery against the noble beast. The second thing to absorb was that behind all the spontaneity and eroticism and generalized festival of the oppressed merrymaking, a grim-faced communist apparat was making preparations for an end to the revels and a serious seizure of the state. The USSR is the sun in our universe, proclaimed Álvaro Cunhal, leader of the Portuguese Stalinists, who'd returned from exile in Moscow to direct operations. The tactics were more those of 1948 in Prague than St. Petersburg in 1917, consisting of the slow acquisition of positions in the army and the police, and the application of what used to be called salami tactics against other parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party enjoyed the support of the majority of the people, so it was not by coincidence that one of its main newspapers, La República, became the target of a spontaneous takeover by the print workers, which their communist union bosses endorsed as if butter would not melt in their mouths. Nor was it by coincidence that the Chemical Workers Union, which had a latent socialist majority among its membership, found some of its communist officials oddly reluctant to hold a ballot. The emergency nationalization of the banks meant opportunities in a state that had formerly been corporatist and monopolistic for the bureaucratic new class to become the owners of large tracts of Africa and the proprietors of seats on the boards of newspapers and television stations. The leader of the Socialist Party, Mário Soares, a man who I would normally have regarded as a pallid and compromising social democrat, summarized the situation with some pith. I still have the question he put to me, double underlined in my notebook from Lisbon. If the army officers are so much on the side of the people, why do they not put on civilian clothes? It was a question not just for that moment. I began to be extremely downcast by the failure, or was it refusal, of my international socialist comrades to see what was staring them right in the face. Intoxicated by the admittedly very moving attempts at personal liberation and social self-management, they could not or would not appreciate how much of this was being manipulated by a dreary conformist sect with an ultimate loyalty to Russia. Thus I found myself one evening in late March 1975 at a huge rally in the Campo Pequeno bullring in Lisbon, organized by the distinctly cautious Socialist Party, but with the invigorating slogan, Socialismo sí, dictadura no. The whole arena was a mass of red flags, and the other chants echoed the original one. There were calls for the right of chemical workers to vote, a banner that read "Down with social fascism," and another that expressed my own views almost perfectly in respect of foreign intervention in Portugal. Nem Kishinger, nem Brezhnev. I took my old friend Colin McCabe along to this event. For his numberless sins, he was at the time a member of the Communist Party, and at first employed an old Maoist catchphrase, waving the red flag to oppose the red flag, to dismiss what he was seeing. But gradually he became more impressed, and as the evening began to crystallize, Jan bent so far as to say, "Sometimes the wrong people can have the right line." I thought then that he'd said more than he intended, and myself experienced the remark as a sort of emancipation from the worry, which did still occasionally nag at me, that by taking up some out-of-line position I would find myself in bed with, as the saying went, unsavoury elements. It's good to throw off this sort of moral blackmail and mind-forged manacle as early in life as one can. Colin, who went on to become a distinguished author of books on James Joyce and Jean-Luc Godard, years later called me from China, where Deng Xiaoping had just announced that his reforms would mean that all would get richer, but some would get richer than others. So, it looks as if your pal Orwell was onto something after all. I thought that was a handsome enough concession. It was rather a poor return when his friend, the grim and fraudulent Stalinist philosopher Louis Althusser, was convicted of murdering his wife, for me to say, "I see Comrade Althusser has been awarded the electric chair of philosophy at the École Abnormale." The sequel takes very little time to tell. The communists and their ultra-left allies hopelessly overplayed their hand by trying for a barracks-based coup. The more traditional and rural and religious elements of Portuguese society rose in an indignant counter-revolution. A sort of equilibrium was restored, and è finita la commedia. The young radicals who'd come from all over Europe to a feast of sex and sunshine and anti-politics folded their tents and doffed their motley and went home. It was the last fall of the curtain on the last act of the 68 style, with its take your desires for reality wall posters and its concept of work as play. For me, it was also the end of the line with my old groupuscule. I had developed other disagreements too, as the old and open-minded international socialists began to mutate into a more party-line sect. But Portugal had broken the mainspring for me, because it had caused me to understand that I thought democracy and pluralism were good things in themselves, and ends in themselves at that, rather than means to another end. In his superb collection of essays, Writers and Politics, which influenced me enormously when I first found it in a public library in Devonshire in 1967, Conor Cruise O'Brien had phrased it better than I could then hope to do. "Are you a socialist?" asked the African leader. I said yes. He looked me in the eye. "People have been telling me," he said, lightly, "that you are a liberal." The statement in its context invited a denial. I said nothing. And yet, as I drove home from my interview with the leader, I had to realize that a liberal incurably was what I was. Whatever I might argue, I was more profoundly attached to liberal concepts of freedom, freedom of speech and of the press, academic freedom, independent judgment and independent judges, than I was to the idea of a disciplined party mobilizing all the forces of society for the creation of a social order, guaranteeing more real freedom for all, instead of just for a few. The revolutionary idea struck me as more immediately relevant for most of humanity than were the liberal concepts. But it was the liberal concepts, and their long-term importance, though not the name of liberal, that held my allegiance. One can read such things and understand and even appreciate them, and one can undergo experiences that recall one to the original text as if in confirmation. I cite O'Brien, not as an argument from authority, for I was to have many disputes with him down the years, but as a man of considerable mind, who brilliantly summarized the contradictions with which I had been living, and with which in many ways I was condemned to go on coexisting for some time to come. O'Brien's definition of liberalism as a position that made the rich world yawn and the poor world sick is a phrasing that older readers may remember, if only because of Phil Oakes's bitingly satirical song, "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." Arrested once in Oxford for disrupting a cricket match with an apartheid South African cricket team, I was able to get myself acquitted of the police frame-up because a bystander came forward and offered himself as an impartial witness. He was a highly respectable citizen and cricket watcher and treasurer of the local Liberal Party. Attending the trial and after giving his testimony, he saw me refuse to take my oath on the Bible and heard me tell the bench as my reason that I was an atheist and a Marxist. After the hearing was over, he came up to me and said that if he had known that I was that kind of person, he would never have volunteered to testify. For many years, this well-meaning but invertebrate figure was my ideal type of the liberal mentality, and he still comes back to me at odd moments.